The scorching Montana sun was merciless as Xander Colt's weathered hands gripped the reins of his stallion. His eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his dusty hat. The year was 1876, and Independence, Montana was still raw and untamed, much like the man himself. Folks in town knew better than to meet his steel-gray gaze for too long. Those who did often found themselves regretting it. There was a darkness about him, something that kept even the most hardened frontiersmen at a distance. But what no one in Independence knew was that Xander's heart wasn't just cold, it was frozen solid by ghosts that rode with him. Silent companions from a past he couldn't outrun. "Mr. Colt," the shopkeeper stammered as Xander entered the general store, his spurs announcing his presence with a metallic song. "What can I get for you today?" "Feed for my horse." "Ammunition." "Coffee," Xander replied, his voice like gravel. He placed a few coins on the counter, the exact amount never one to invite unnecessary conversation by requiring change. "Yes, sir. Right away." The man hurried to gather the items, nearly knocking over a display in his haste. Xander's ranch, the Broken Arrow, sat 10 miles outside of town, far enough to keep curious folks from wandering onto his land, close enough to get supplies when needed. He'd built it with his own hands after the war, when nightmares of Gettysburg made sleeping in town impossible. Out there, with only the mountains watching, he could wake up shouting without neighbors pounding on his door. The door to the shop swung open, the bell above it tinkling cheerfully, a sound at odds with the tension that filled the room. Xander didn't turn immediately. He had learned long ago that sudden movements often led to trouble. "I'm sorry, madam, but we're closing early today," the shopkeeper called out, his voice unusually high. "Mr. Colt is. I can see perfectly well who's here, Mr. Peterson," came a woman's voice, clear and steady as a mountain stream. "And I've ridden too far to turn around without my supplies." That got Xander's attention. He turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving closer to his revolver. The woman who stood in the doorway was not what he expected. Dressed in a practical riding outfit, her honey-colored hair pulled back beneath a wide-brimmed hat, she met his gaze without flinching. Most people in town couldn't manage that. "Hope Zimmerman," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I've purchased the old Jenkins place." Xander stared at her hand but made no move to take it. The Jenkins place bordered his land to the east, land he'd been planning to buy himself when he had the funds. "That land's no good for farming," he said flatly. "Soil's too rocky." "Good thing I don't plan to farm it then," she replied, lowering her hand but not her gaze. "I'm starting a horse breeding operation." The shopkeeper looked between them, clutching Xander's purchases to his chest as if they might shield him. "That's Comanche territory," Xander continued, his voice low. "Not safe for a woman alone." Hope's eyebrows rose slightly. "I wasn't aware the Comanche had been active in this area for several years, and I'm not alone. I have 2 ranch hands coming from Wyoming next week. 2 men won't stop a raid if they decide to come." "Then I suppose I'll have to deal with that if it happens," she replied, moving past him to the counter. "Mr. Peterson, I need seed for the garden plot, nails, lumber, and any preserved food you can spare. I'll be back for it tomorrow with my wagon." Xander watched her, puzzled by her calm demeanor. Most newcomers to independence were either brash young men looking to make their fortune or families with tired eyes and desperate hopes. This woman was neither. "Where you from?" he asked abruptly. "St. Louis, most recently," she answered without turning. "Though I grew up in Colorado territory." "What brings you to Independence?" Now she did turn, and something in her eyes, a shadow, a hint of the same darkness he carried, made him pause. "The same thing that brings most people to places like this, Mr. Colt, a fresh start." She nodded to the shopkeeper. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson. I'll return tomorrow." With that, she walked out, leaving Xander staring after her. It wasn't until she'd mounted her horse, a fine chestnut mare that he couldn't help but admire, that he realized the shopkeeper was holding out his purchases. "She bought that place outright," Peterson said quietly as Xander took the items. "Paid in gold. Strange woman, coming all this way alone." Xander grunted in response, his mind still on the neighboring property. The Jenkins place had been abandoned for nearly 2 years after old man Jenkins had died of pneumonia. The cabin was probably half collapsed by now, the fences broken down. It would take more than 2 ranch hands to make it workable again. "Not my concern," he muttered, more to himself than the shopkeeper. He had his own problems to worry about: cattle to move, fences to mend, a living to scratch out of the unforgiving Montana earth. What Hope Zimmerman did with her property was her business, as long as she kept to herself. But as he rode back to the Broken Arrow, the image of those steady eyes meeting his without fear stayed with him longer than he cared to admit. The next few weeks passed in a blur of dust and sweat for Xander. Summer in Montana meant long days of backbreaking work, and he welcomed the exhaustion that came with it. The more tired his body, the less his mind wandered to places best left forgotten. He saw smoke rising from the Jenkins place, the Zimmerman place now, and occasionally caught glimpses of workers rebuilding fences and repairing the cabin. True to her word, 2 men had arrived, and from what Xander could see from his property, they knew their business. But he kept his distance, just as he did from everyone else in these parts. It was early August when their paths crossed again. Xander was tracking a mountain lion that had been picking off his calves when he found himself near the creek that separated their properties. The beast's tracks led straight toward the Zimmerman place. As he followed the trail, the sound of a rifle shot cracked through the air. Xander spurred his horse forward, cresting a small rise to find Hope standing over the body of the very cat he'd been tracking. Her rifle was still raised, wisps of smoke curling from the barrel. She turned at the sound of his approach, lowering her weapon only slightly when she recognized him. "Mr. Colt," she acknowledged. "I believe this creature has been helping himself to my chickens. And if I'm not mistaken, some of your calves as well." Xander dismounted, examining the clean shot that had taken the mountain lion through the heart. "Good shooting," he said grudgingly. "My father taught me." She slung the rifle over her shoulder. "Would you like the pelt?" "Since he's been troubling your herd too?" The offer surprised him. "No, you killed it. It's yours by right." Hope nodded, then gestured to the creek. "While you're here, I wanted to discuss water rights. I know this creek runs through both our properties." "It starts on my land," Xander said immediately, his tone hardening. Water was life out here, and he wasn't about to share what little he had. "I'm aware," she replied calmly. "I'm not looking to take anything that's yours, Mr. Colt. I simply want to be clear about boundaries so we can avoid any misunderstandings in the future." Xander studied her for a long moment. Most people in these parts would have either demanded access or tried to steal it. Direct confrontation was refreshing, if unexpected. "Creek's all yours on your side of the property line," he finally said. "But if you dam it or divert it, I won't," she cut in. "I understand the value of good neighbors, Mr. Colt, even if they prefer solitude." Something in her tone made him bristle. "You don't know the first thing about me, Miss Zimmerman." A slight smile curved her lips. "I know more than you might think. Small towns talk, and independence is no exception." "And what exactly do they say?" he challenged, stepping closer. "That you fought for the Union. That you came here after the war and haven't left your ranch except for supplies in 5 years. That you once broke a man's jaw for suggesting your cattle had crossed onto his land." Her eyes met his, unflinching. "That you're dangerous." Xander's jaw tightened. "And yet here you are, alone, talking water rights with me." "I've never put much stock in town gossip, Mr. Colt. I prefer to form my own opinions." "And what opinion have you formed?" The question came out before he could stop it. Hope considered him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "That you're a man who's built walls so high even you don't remember what's on the other side anymore." The accuracy of her assessment hit him like a physical blow. Anger flared in his chest, the familiar, comfortable heat of it burning away the momentary vulnerability her words had exposed. "Keep your amateur philosophizing to yourself, Miss Zimmerman," he growled, "and keep to your side of the creek." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away without a backward glance, ignoring the weight of her gaze on his back. As summer faded into fall, Xander found himself watching the Zimmerman place more often than he cared to admit. From his vantage point on the hill above his cabin, he could see her property clearly. The transformation was remarkable. The cabin had been repaired and expanded, the fences rebuilt, and a proper stable constructed. A small herd of horses, no more than a dozen, grazed in the pasture nearest the creek. He told himself his interest was purely practical. A neighbor's success or failure could affect his own ranch. But deep down, he knew it was something else that drew his eyes eastward. Hope Zimmerman was a puzzle, and despite his best efforts to remain disinterested, he found himself wanting to understand her. The first snowfall came early that year, a mid-October storm that dropped 6 inches overnight and caught many in the territory unprepared. Xander wasn't concerned for himself. His woodpile was stacked high, his storehouse filled with preserved meat and vegetables. But as the snow continued to fall for a second day, his thoughts turned to the Zimmerman place. Had she prepared for a Montana winter? Did she understand how quickly the weather could turn deadly out here? It wasn't his problem, he reminded himself. And yet, as dusk approached and the snow showed no signs of letting up, he found himself saddling his horse. "Just being a good neighbor," he muttered to himself as he rode through the gathering darkness, following the creek toward her property. Nothing more. The lights from her cabin windows glowed warm against the white landscape. Smoke curled from the chimney, a good sign that at least she had heat. As he approached, one of her ranch hands emerged from the stable, rifle in hand. "That's far enough," the man called out, raising the weapon. "State your business." "Xander Colt," he replied, raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "I own the neighboring ranch, just checking that you folks are prepared for the storm." The man lowered his rifle slightly but didn't invite him closer. "We're fine." Miss Zimmerman knew winter was coming. "Jackson," Hope's voice carried from the cabin doorway. "Who is it, neighbor?" the man called back. "Colt." Hope appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy shawl. "Mr. Colt," she called out, "this is unexpected. Please come in out of the cold." The ranch hand Jackson looked uncertain but stepped aside as Hope waved Xander toward the cabin. "My horse," Xander began. "Jackson will see to it," Hope interrupted. "Won't you?" The man nodded reluctantly, taking the reins as Xander dismounted. The interior of the cabin was warm and surprisingly cozy. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was simple but well made: a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fire, shelves lined with books. The scent of something savory filled the air. "Stew," Hope explained, noting his interest. "Venison. Jackson got a buck last week." She gestured to the table. "Join us for supper. There's plenty." Xander hesitated. He hadn't planned to stay, hadn't expected to be invited in at all. "I just came to make sure you had what you needed for the winter," he said stiffly. "Storms like this can last for days." That's unexpectedly thoughtful of you, Hope replied, genuine surprise in her voice. We're well prepared, but I appreciate the concern. An awkward silence fell between them. Xander shifted his weight, suddenly aware that he hadn't been inside another person's home in years. The domesticity of it, the pot bubbling on the stove, the neatly swept floor, the small touches that made the cabin a home felt foreign and vaguely threatening. I should go, he said abruptly. Hope frowned. In this weather, that would be foolish, even for someone who knows the territory as well as you do, the snow's coming down harder and nights falling. As if to punctuate her point, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Xander knew she was right. Riding back to his ranch now would be dangerous, possibly fatal if the temperature dropped further and the storm intensified. You can leave at first light, Hope continued. The stable is warm and your horse will be comfortable there. You can take my ranch hands. Bunk Lewis is in town and won't be back until the storm passes. Before Xander could respond, the door opened and Jackson entered, stamping snow from his boots. Your horse is settled, Mr. Colt, he reported. Gave him some hay and a blanket. Thank you, Xander said stiffly, unaccustomed to accepting help. Hope moved to the stove, ladling stew into bowls. Sit, both of you, food's ready. The meal passed in relative silence. The stew was good, rich with vegetables and tender meat, and Xander found himself eating more than he had intended. Jackson spoke little, answering Hope's occasional questions about the horses and the state of the stable with brief responses. Xander said nothing at all, though he felt Hope's gaze on him from time to time. After they'd eaten, Jackson excused himself to check on the animals one last time before turning in, leaving Xander alone with Hope. More coffee, she offered, already reaching for the pot. He nodded, extending his cup. Thank you. You're a man of few words, Mr. Colt, Hope observed as she poured. Is that by nature or by choice? Xander took a sip of the strong, black coffee. Both, I suppose. She settled back in her chair, studying him over the rim of her own cup. I've often found that the quietest men have the most interesting stories. They simply choose not to share them. Or perhaps they have nothing worth saying, he countered. A smile curved her lips. I doubt that's true in your case. Again, that unsettling feeling that she could see through the walls he'd so carefully constructed. Xander shifted uncomfortably. Why independence? He asked, changing the subject. There are better places for horse breeding, places with milder winters, more water. Hope's expression changed subtly, a shadow passing over her features. Independence offered what I needed: land at a fair price and a fresh start. Running from something, her eyebrows rose slightly. Aren't we all in one way or another? Xander didn't respond, but something in her words resonated with him. Everyone in these territories was running from something: law, debts, memories, ghosts. He had his own phantoms that followed him like shadows. What kind of horses are you breeding? He asked after a moment, genuinely curious despite himself. Hope's face brightened at the question. Quarter horses, primarily. Fast, sturdy, good for ranch work. But I have a Morgan mare and a thoroughbred stallion I brought from St. Louis. I'm hoping to develop a line that combines speed with endurance. Ambitious, Xander commented. Takes time to establish a breeding program like that. Years. I'm not planning on going anywhere, Mr. Colt. Their eyes met across the table, and something passed between them: recognition, perhaps, of a shared determination. For a brief moment, the walls Xander had built seemed less solid than before. The moment was broken by a particularly violent gust of wind that sent snow swirling against the windows. I'll show you where you can sleep, Hope said, rising from the table. It's not much, but it's warm. The small room off the main living area contained two narrow bunks, a chest for clothes, and little else. A lantern burned low on a small table between the beds. "Jackson sleeps here," Hope explained, gesturing to the lower bunk. "Lewis takes the top one. You can have his tonight." "Thank you," Xander said, the words still uncomfortable in his mouth. "For the meal and the bed." Hope paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. "You know, Mr. Colt, a simple act of neighborliness doesn't have to mean anything more than what it is. You checked on my welfare during a storm. I offered you shelter in return. Out here, that's how people survive." With that, she left him alone with his thoughts, closing the door softly behind her. Xander sat on the edge of the bunk, removing his boots. Her words echoed in his mind. A simple act of neighborliness. Was that truly all it had been? He wasn't sure anymore. Something about Hope Zimmerman had gotten under his skin: her directness, her self-sufficiency, the shadows in her eyes that matched his own. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about another person's story rather than trying to outrun his own. Morning came with clearing skies and a world transformed by snow. Xander rose early, folding the borrowed blankets neatly and placing them at the foot of the bunk. The cabin was quiet, the fire in the main room banked to coals overnight but still providing warmth. He found Hope in the kitchen, already dressed and preparing breakfast. The scent of coffee filled the air. "You're an early riser," she commented without turning. "Always have been," he replied, accepting the cup she offered. "Need to check my stock after a storm like this." Hope nodded. "Of course. I've asked Jackson to saddle your horse. He should be ready by the time you've eaten." They broke their fast with cornbread and bacon, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been the night before. When they finished, Xander rose to leave, donning his heavy coat and hat. "Thank you," he said at the door, "for your hospitality." Hope smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes. "That's what neighbors do, Mr. Colt." "Xander," he corrected, surprising himself. "My name is Xander." Her smile widened slightly. "Xander, then. Safe ride home." The journey back to his ranch was peaceful, the world muffled by snow, the morning sun casting long blue shadows across the white landscape. Xander found his thoughts returning to Hope's cabin, to the warmth of it, the sense of purpose that seemed to fill every corner. His own place, he realized, had never felt like that. It was shelter, nothing more. A place to sleep between days of work. Never a home. The realization disturbed him more than he cared to admit. His cattle had weathered the storm well enough, huddled together in the lee of a stand of pine trees. The barn was intact, though the weight of snow had caused one corner of the roof to sag dangerously. It would need repair before the next storm. As he worked through his daily chores, Xander found his gaze drifting eastward more than usual, toward the Zimmerman place. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney, a sign of life in the vast white expanse. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude not as the comfort it had always been, but as something heavier, more constrictive. The walls he had built to keep the world at bay suddenly seemed like a prison of his own making. "Nonsense," he muttered to himself as he forked hay to his horses. "One meal with a neighbor doesn't change anything." But deep down, he knew something had shifted, like the first crack in river ice at the beginning of spring, small but significant, a harbinger of greater change to come. The weeks following the October storm brought a temporary thaw, what old-timers called Indian summer, a last breath of warmth before winter settled in for good. Xander used the time to make repairs to his barn, splitting and stacking more firewood, and moving his cattle to the lower pastures where they would be better protected from the harsh weather to come. He told himself he wasn't avoiding riding near the Zimmerman place, but he knew it for the lie it was. The night he'd spent under Hope's roof had unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Better to focus on his work, on the rhythms of ranch life that had sustained him for years. But Independence was a small town, and eventually their paths crossed again. Xander was loading supplies into his wagon outside the general store when Hope rode up, leading a second horse with empty panniers for her own purchases. "Mr. Colt," she greeted him, dismounting with easy grace. "Good to see you recovered from the storm without incident." "Miss Zimmerman," he replied with a nod, "your place hold up all right. Well enough, though we lost part of the stable roof. Jackson and Lewis managed to repair it before the next snow came through." She studied him for a moment. "You've been scarce these past weeks." Xander busied himself securing a crate of ammunition. "Been busy, winter preparations." "Of course," Hope said, though something in her tone suggested she didn't entirely believe him. "While we're both here, I was hoping to discuss something with you." A business proposition of sorts. That caught his attention. "What kind of proposition?" "I've been observing your cattle operation," she began. "You've got good stock, healthy animals, but your grazing land is limited, especially in winter." Xander's expression hardened. "I manage just fine." "I'm sure you do," Hope continued smoothly. "But I have more grazing land than I need for my horses. Land that's going to waste. I'm proposing a trade. You can graze some of your herd on my eastern pastures through the winter. In exchange, I'd like to use your bull for breeding come spring. I've got 3 milk cows, but no bull of my own." It was a fair offer, more than fair, actually. Xander's winter grazing was indeed limited, forcing him to supplement with expensive hay. Having access to additional pasture would save him money and potentially allow him to increase his herd. "Why would you offer this?" he asked suspiciously. Hope shrugged. "It's practical. Your land has better water access. Mine has better winter grazing. We each have something the other needs. Out here, cooperation makes more sense than isolation, don't you think?" There it was again, that gentle challenge to the walls he'd built. Xander shifted uncomfortably. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "Don't think too long," Hope replied, turning toward the store entrance. "Winter's coming, and those pastures won't do your cattle much good once they're buried under 3 feet of snow." She was right, of course. The pragmatic part of him, the part that had kept him alive and his ranch functioning all these years, recognized the wisdom of her offer. But accepting meant acknowledging a connection, a dependency, however mutually beneficial. "I'll let you know by week's end," he called after her. Hope paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "I'll expect your answer then. Good day, Mr. Colt." As she disappeared into the store, Xander found himself staring at the empty doorway, wondering when exactly Hope Zimmerman had begun to dismantle his carefully constructed isolation, and why he was allowing it to happen. 3 days later, Xander rode to the Zimmerman place with his decision. The logic was undeniable. His cattle needed the grazing land, and a trade was far better than paying for additional feed. Still, as he approached the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a boundary more significant than the property line between their ranches. Hope was in the corral, working with a young bay gelding. She moved with confidence, her commands clear and consistent as she guided the horse through basic maneuvers. Xander watched for a moment, appreciating her skill. She knew horses, that much was clear. She noticed him as he dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post near the corral fence. "Mr. Colt," she called, walking the gelding to the rail. "You've made your decision, I take it?" "I have," he replied, removing his hat as she approached. "Your offer makes sense. My cattle for your pasture, my bull for your cows in the spring." Hope smiled, a flash of genuine pleasure that transformed her face. "Excellent. When would you like to move your herd?" Tomorrow, if that suits. Storms coming in from the north. Better to get them settled before it hits. Tomorrow is fine. Jackson can help you drive them over if you'd like. Xander shook his head. I can manage. Hope studied him for a moment, then shrugged. As you wish. Would you like to see the pasture I had in mind? Make sure it meets your needs. They rode together along the eastern edge of her property, where a wide meadow stretched toward a line of distant hills. Protected from the worst of the winter winds by a ridge to the north, the grazing land was indeed better than anything on Xander's property. This will do fine, he acknowledged as they surveyed the area. Your horses don't use this section. Hope shook her head. I keep them closer to the stable in winter. This is going to waste otherwise. As they rode back toward her cabin, Xander found himself observing the changes she'd made to the property since her arrival. The fences were solid, the outbuildings well maintained. Her horses, perhaps 20 in all now, were in excellent condition, their coats gleaming despite the approaching winter. You've done good work here, he said unexpectedly. Jenkins let the place go to ruin before he died. I hardly recognize it now. Hope glanced at him, surprise evident in her expression. Thank you. It's been a lot of work, but worth it. She paused, then added, Your place isn't exactly what I expected either. How so? Xander asked, curious despite himself. It's orderly, efficient. Everything has a purpose. She smiled slightly. Like its owner, I suppose. Xander wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not. A ranch is a business, he said flatly. Has to be run that way to survive. Of course. But it can be more than that too, can it? A home, not just a place to work. The observation hit too close to his earlier thoughts. Xander didn't respond, his jaw tightening as they rode the rest of the way in silence. At the cabin, Hope dismounted and secured her horse. Would you like to come in for coffee? Discuss the details of our arrangement. Every instinct told Xander to decline, to retreat to the safety of his solitude. But something, curiosity perhaps, or a loneliness he refused to acknowledge, made him nod instead. Coffee would be good, he said gruffly. Just for a few minutes. Inside, the cabin was as warm and inviting as he remembered. Hope moved about the kitchen with easy familiarity, setting water to boil and grinding coffee beans. Your men not around? Xander asked, noting the quiet. Lewis took a wagon into town for supplies. Jackson's out checking fence lines before the storm. She glanced at him over her shoulder. Does it make you uncomfortable being alone with me? The directness of the question caught him off guard. No, he answered honestly. Should it? Hope laughed, a warm sound that filled the small space. No, it shouldn't, but people talk even out here. Two unmarried neighbors spending time together. Well, you know how it goes. Let them talk, Xander said dismissively. Gossip's just another way to pass the winter. Hope nodded, bringing 2 steaming cups to the table where he sat. I agree. Still, I appreciate your willingness to risk your reputation for a cup of coffee. There was a teasing quality to her voice that Xander wasn't accustomed to. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with anything other than caution or deference. My reputation's already set, he replied, accepting the cup. Don't think a few visits to your place will change that. And what reputation is that exactly? Hope asked, settling across from him. The dangerous loner, the grim rancher who speaks only when necessary. Something like that, he admitted. Hope studied him, her head tilted slightly. You know, reputations can change, Xander. They're not set in stone. The use of his first name, so casual, so unexpected, sent a jolt through him. He covered his surprise by taking a long sip of coffee, using the moment to regain his composure. Maybe some people don't want their reputations to change, he finally said. Maybe they've worked hard to build them. Have you? Worked hard to keep people at a distance, I mean. Again, that uncomfortable feeling that she could see right through him. "What is it you want from me, Miss Zimmerman?" he asked bluntly. "Hope," she corrected. "If I'm using your given name, you should use mine." She leaned back in her chair, considering his question. "I don't want anything from you except what we've already agreed to winter grazing for my bull's services in spring, and perhaps a neighborly relationship based on mutual respect rather than avoidance." "I don't avoid you," Xander protested. Hope raised an eyebrow. 3 weeks without so much as riding by after spending a night under my roof. That's not avoidance, Xander shifted uncomfortably. "Been busy." "Of course," she replied, though her tone suggested she didn't believe him. "Well, our arrangement will require at least occasional interaction. I hope that won't be too burdensome for you." There was something in her eyes, a challenge, perhaps, or simple curiosity that made Xander want to prove her wrong. To show her that he wasn't incapable of normal human interaction, just out of practice. "It won't," he said firmly. "In fact, you should come see my place sometime. Check on your cows, make sure the bull meets your standards." The invitation surprised them both. Hope's eyes widened slightly, then a slow smile spread across her face. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you." They finished their coffee discussing the practical aspects of their arrangement, when to move the cattle, which areas were best for grazing, how to handle any problems that might arise. By the time Xander left, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. As he rode home, he found himself reviewing their conversation, analyzing each word, each expression. There was something about Hope that unsettled him, that made him question the life he'd built for himself. The walls he'd constructed so carefully seemed less solid than before, as if her mere presence had begun to erode their foundations. The next day, Xander moved 30 head of cattle onto Hope's eastern pasture. True to his word, he managed the task alone, though it took most of the morning. As the last of the animals settled into grazing, he looked up to see Hope approaching on horseback, her figure silhouetted against the winter sky. "All settled," she called as she drew near. Xander nodded. "They seem content enough. Good grass here, even with the snow. This meadow stays relatively clear through most of winter," she explained, riding alongside him as they surveyed the herd. "The ridge blocks the worst of the drifting snow, and the sun melts what does fall faster than in the shaded areas." They rode in companionable silence for a time, checking the perimeter of the pasture to ensure the fences were secure. It struck Xander that this was the most time he'd spent in another person's company willingly, at least in years. More surprising was that he didn't find it unpleasant. "Storm's coming," Hope observed, looking at the heavy clouds gathering to the northwest. "Should hit by nightfall." "Best get back then," Xander replied. "Make sure everything's secured." Hope nodded her agreement, but as they turned their horses toward home, she hesitated. "Would you join us for supper tonight? It seems only right to celebrate our new arrangement." The invitation was unexpected, though perhaps it shouldn't have been. Hope seemed determined to forge some kind of connection between them, despite his initial reluctance. "I should check my place before the storm," he hedged. "Of course," Hope replied smoothly. Another time, perhaps. Something in her easy acceptance of his refusal made Xander reconsider. "But I could come after," he found himself saying. "Won't be dark for hours yet." The smile that illuminated Hope's face made something twist in Xander's chest, a feeling so long forgotten he almost didn't recognize it. Pleasure at bringing joy to another person. "Wonderful," she said. "Come by whenever you're ready. We usually eat around 6. As they parted ways at the property line, Xander found himself watching her ride away, wondering what exactly he'd gotten himself into. It was just a business arrangement, he reminded himself. Neighbors helping neighbors. Nothing more. But as he rode home to prepare for the coming storm, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, not just in his relationship with Hope Zimmerman, but in himself as well. The winter of 1876-1877 proved to be one of the harshest in memory for Montana territory. Storm after storm swept down from the north, burying the land in snow and testing the resolve of even the most seasoned settlers. But for Xander Colt, it was a winter of unexpected discovery. What had begun as a purely practical arrangement between neighbors evolved into something neither had anticipated. The shared responsibility of caring for their livestock through the brutal weather created a bond that deepened with each passing week. Xander found himself riding to the Zimmerman place more often than strictly necessary, ostensibly to check on his cattle, but increasingly drawn by the warm welcome he received there. Hope's cabin became a refuge of sorts, a place where the crushing solitude of his own existence temporarily lifted. They fell into a routine. Every few days, Xander would ride over to help with the heavier work around Hope's ranch, repairing storm damage, clearing paths through the deepening snow, ensuring the animals had access to feed and water. In return, Hope shared meals with him, engaging him in conversations that gradually coaxed him out of his shell. It was during one such evening in late January, as a blizzard howled outside and they sat before the fire drinking coffee laced with whiskey, that Hope finally asked the question Xander had been dreading. "What happened to you, Xander? Before independence, I mean." He stared into the flames, the amber liquid in his cup suddenly more interesting than it had been moments before. The comfortable silence between them stretched, became taut with expectation. "War happened," he finally said, his voice rough, "like it did to a lot of men." Hope waited, patient, giving him space to continue or retreat as he chose. It was that patience more than anything that made him go on. "I was at Gettysburg, and Antietam before that, saw things." He paused, took a long swallow of his drink. "Did things no man should have to live with." "You fought for the Union," Hope said softly. "It wasn't a question." Xander nodded. "Enlisted in '61, right after Fort Sumter. Was 22, thought I was indestructible." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Found out different quick enough. And after the war, drifted west. Couldn't go back to Ohio, nothing there for me anymore. Family farm was gone, parents dead from fever. Brother killed at Shiloh." The words came easier now, like stones carried too long finally being set down. "Tried working cattle drives in Texas, mining in Colorado. Nothing stuck until I came here in '71. Bought the Broken Arrow when it was just a claim and a rundown shack." Hope's eyes never left his face as he spoke. "You built it yourself." "Every inch of it," he confirmed. "Gave me something to focus on besides." He gestured vaguely, unable to articulate the ghosts that had haunted him. "Besides the memories," Hope finished for him. Xander nodded, meeting her gaze for the first time since he'd begun speaking. "Your turn," he said quietly. "Why independence? Why alone?" Hope sighed, setting her cup aside. "It's not a pleasant story. Few of them are out here." She was silent for a long moment, gathering her thoughts or perhaps her courage. "I was married," she finally said. "In St. Louis. My husband was a successful businessman, shipping mainly. Everyone thought I was fortunate to have made such a match." The bitterness in her voice told Xander this story wasn't heading toward a happy conclusion. "Frederick had a temper," Hope continued, her eyes on the fire. "He hid it well in public, but in private, well, he was very concerned with appearances, with control. When things didn't go exactly as he wanted, he would become unpleasant." Xander's hand tightened around his cup. "He hurt you?" It wasn't a question, but Hope nodded anyway. "Yes. For 3 years I endured it. Made excuses for the bruises, the broken wrist, the cracked ribs. told myself it would get better, that he would change. A humorless laugh escaped her. He didn't, of course. Men like that never do. What happened? Xander asked, though part of him didn't want to hear the answer. He died, Hope said simply. Pneumonia, of all things. All his money and power, and in the end it was a winter chill that took him. She looked up, meeting Xander's gaze steadily. I felt nothing when he died. Not grief, not relief, just emptiness. And that scared me more than he ever had. So you left? Hope nodded. I sold everything except what I could carry or transport. Used the money to buy this place, sight unseen, and headed west. Needed to start fresh, somewhere no one knew my story, where I wouldn't be poor Mrs. Zimmerman, the widow, or worse, that woman whose husband used to beat her. The rawness of her confession hung in the air between them. Xander understood now why she had seemed so undaunted by him when they first met after what she had endured. A gruff neighbor with a cold demeanor was hardly frightening. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words inadequate but sincere. Hope's smile was small but genuine. Don't be, I survived. I'm here, and I'm building something that's truly mine. She reached across the space between them, her fingers lightly touching the back of his hand. We're more alike than you might think, Xander, both trying to outrun our ghosts. The touch of her hand, warm, gentle, undemanding, sent a jolt through Xander that had nothing to do with fear or anger, the emotions he was most accustomed to. For a brief, disorienting moment, he wanted to turn his palm up, to clasp her fingers in his own. Instead, he carefully withdrew his hand, using the pretext of refilling his cup to break the contact. But the feeling lingered, a warmth that had nothing to do with whiskey or the fire before them. It's getting late, he said, rising from his chair. Storm's easing. I should head back while I can still make it through the drifts. Hope didn't try to persuade him to stay, though the disappointment in her eyes was clear. Of course, she said, standing as well. Thank you for your help today and for listening. At the door, as Xander donned his heavy coat and hat, Hope touched his arm lightly. Xander, she said quietly, we all have wounds, some are just more visible than others. He looked down at her, this woman who had endured so much yet remained unbroken, and felt something shift inside him, a crack in the ice he'd built around his heart. Good night, Hope, he said softly, and stepped out into the snow-hushed night. The ride home was cold and dark, but Xander barely noticed. His mind was filled with Hope's story, with the courage it had taken her to leave everything behind and start anew. He'd thought himself strong for surviving the war, for building his ranch from nothing. But Hope's strength was of a different kind, quieter perhaps, but no less formidable. And she had shared it with him, had trusted him with her truth. The realization humbled him in a way few things had. As he stabled his horse and prepared for bed in his cold, empty cabin, Xander found himself comparing it to Hope's home. The physical structures weren't so different, both simple frontier dwellings built for function rather than comfort. But hers felt alive, while his was merely shelter. The difference, he realized, wasn't in the buildings themselves but in the spirit that inhabited them. Hope had created a home, a place of warmth and welcome despite, or perhaps because of the hardships she had endured. Xander, in contrast, had built a fortress, designed to keep the world at bay rather than embrace it. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering if there might be another way to live, if the walls he'd constructed to protect himself might actually be the very things preventing him from healing. The thought followed him into sleep, where his dreams were not of battlefields for once, but of a woman with steady eyes and the courage to begin again. February brought a brief respite from the relentless storms. The sun emerged, glinting off the snow-covered landscape and raising spirits throughout the territory. Xander used the break in the weather to make much-needed repairs to his property and check on the condition of his cattle on Hope's land. The herd was faring better than he'd expected, sheltered from the worst of the weather and still finding adequate grazing. As he rode among them, counting heads and checking for signs of illness or injury, he spotted Hope approaching from the direction of her cabin. She rode with easy confidence, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her breath clouding in the crisp air. Something tightened in Xander's chest at the sight of her, a feeling both familiar and strange, like remembering a song he hadn't heard in years. "They look good," Hope called as she drew near. "You haven't lost any." Xander shook his head. "Not one. Better than I expected, given the weather." "It's a good spot," she agreed, bringing her horse alongside his. "My grandfather used to say you can judge a piece of land by how it treats animals in winter. This one's been kind." They rode together along the edge of the pasture, companionable in their shared purpose. Xander found himself studying Hope's profile, the determined set of her jaw, the clarity of her gaze as she surveyed her property. There was a quiet dignity about her that he admired. "I've been thinking," Hope said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. "Spring will be here before we know it. With it comes calving season for you, foaling for me." "True enough," Xander agreed, wondering where she was heading with this observation. "Both keep a rancher busy day and night. Extra hands make the work lighter." She turned to face him directly. "I'm proposing we help each other. My men and I assist with your calving, you help with my foals. Share the burden, so to speak." The suggestion made practical sense. Calving and foaling were exhausting, demanding constant attention to ensure the safety of both mothers and offspring. Having additional help would be valuable. But Xander hesitated, sensing that accepting would mean crossing another boundary, moving from occasional neighbor interaction to something more like partnership. "It's a good offer," he acknowledged, "but your men have their own work, and I've managed on my own before." "Managing isn't the same as thriving, Xander," Hope replied, her voice gentle but firm. "And yes, Jackson and Lewis have their duties, but I'm talking about the difficult cases, the breech births, the first-time mothers, the situations where an extra pair of hands makes all the difference." She was right, of course. Every rancher dreaded those middle-of-the-night emergencies where minutes could mean life or death for a valuable animal. "And what do you get out of this arrangement?" Xander asked, still suspicious of generosity without clear benefit. Hope's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Besides your help with my foals, the satisfaction of being a good neighbor, and perhaps—" She paused, her eyes meeting his directly. "Perhaps the pleasure of your company." The frankness of her statement caught Xander off guard. Most women he'd known, admittedly few in recent years, would have couched such a sentiment in more delicate terms or not expressed it at all. "My company isn't generally considered pleasurable," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Hope laughed, the sound bright in the winter stillness. "I disagree. I find you quite interesting, Xander Colt. When you forget to maintain that forbidding exterior, you're actually quite good company." Before he could formulate a response, she continued, "Think about my offer. There's no rush to decide." With that, she turned her horse toward home. "Join us for dinner tonight. Lewis shot an elk yesterday, more than enough to share." The invitation was casual, as if they dined together regularly, which, Xander realized with some surprise, they nearly did these days. Somehow, over the course of the winter, he'd gone from avoiding his neighbor to spending several evenings a week at her table. "I'll be there," he found himself saying. "Need anything from my place?" "Just yourself," Hope replied with a smile. "Around 6. As she rode away, Xander remained still, watching her figure grow smaller against the white landscape. The encounter left him unsettled, though not unpleasantly so. There was something about Hope Zimmerman that consistently challenged his carefully constructed worldview, his belief that solitude was preferable to company, that independence meant relying on no one. She made him question assumptions he'd held for so long they had calcified into certainties. And strangely, he didn't resent her for it. That evening, as they shared elk stew and fresh bread around Hope's table, Xander found himself more at ease than he could remember being in years. Jackson and Lewis were there too, contributing stories of their own ranching experiences that had them all laughing. It struck Xander that he couldn't recall the last time he'd laughed genuinely, without reservation. After the meal, Lewis and Jackson excused themselves to check on the animals one last time before turning in, leaving Xander and Hope alone by the fire. "You've created something good here," Xander observed, watching the flames dance. "Not just the ranch, but this." He gestured vaguely to the room around them, unable to articulate exactly what he meant. Hope seemed to understand anyway. "A home," she supplied. "A place where people feel welcome." "Yes," he agreed. "It's not something every ranch manages to be." "Including yours?" Hope asked gently. Xander shifted in his chair. "The broken arrow serves its purpose. As shelter, you mean, not as a home." "I don't need more than that," he said, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. Hope was quiet for a long moment, contemplating the fire. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but clear. "Everyone needs more than just shelter, Xander, even you." The simple statement hit him with unexpected force. For years, he'd convinced himself that he was different, that the things other people seemed to need or want, connection, companionship, warmth, were unnecessary complications, distractions from the work of survival. But sitting in Hope's cabin, surrounded by the evidence of a life fully lived despite tremendous pain, he found it harder to maintain that conviction. "I've been alone a long time," he finally said. "Not sure I remember how to be otherwise." Hope's eyes met his across the space between them. "It's not something you forget," she said. "It's just something you might be out of practice with." She leaned forward slightly, her expression earnest. "And practice makes perfect, or so they say." There was an invitation in her words, not to anything improper, but to something perhaps more frightening. The possibility of connection, of allowing someone past the walls he'd built so carefully. "I'll help with your foals," Xander said abruptly, changing the subject. "And I'd welcome the assistance with calving." If Hope was disappointed by his retreat from the more personal conversation, she didn't show it. "Thank you," she said simply. "I think it will benefit us both." As the evening drew to a close and Xander prepared to leave, Hope walked him to the door as had become their custom. But this time, as he donned his coat, she reached up and straightened his collar with a casual intimacy that left him momentarily speechless. "Ride safe," she said softly. "See you tomorrow." Xander nodded, unable to find words for the riot of emotions her simple touch had unleashed. As he rode home through the moonlit snow, he found himself replaying the moment again and again, the warmth of her fingers against his neck, the scent of her hair as she leaned close, the gentle concern in her eyes. It had been so long since anyone had touched him with kindness that he'd forgotten how it felt, like a flame rekindled, warming parts of him that had been cold for years. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. The walls he'd built around himself weren't just crumbling. They were being dismantled brick by brick, with his own reluctant cooperation, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to stop it from happening. As February gave way to March, the first hints of spring began to appear across the Montana landscape. The days grew longer, the sun stronger, and patches of bare earth emerged from beneath the melting snow. With the changing season came new life, the first calves in Xander's herd, the earliest foals in Hope's breeding program. True to their agreement, they helped each other through the demanding work. When a heifer struggled with a breech birth in the middle of a rainy night, Hope was there beside Xander, her sleeves rolled up, her voice steady as they worked together to save both mother and calf. When one of Hope's most valuable mares showed signs of a difficult labor, Xander rode through darkness to assist, staying until dawn to ensure the foal was nursing properly. The shared work created a bond between them that transcended their initial neighborly arrangement. They developed a shorthand, anticipating each other's needs and movements with an ease that surprised them both. In the quiet moments between crises, sitting together in a barn watching a newborn take its first wobbly steps, sharing coffee as the sun rose over the mountains, they talked more openly than either had with anyone in years. Xander found himself sharing stories from his childhood in Ohio, memories he'd thought long buried. Hope spoke of her dreams for her horse breeding program, of the bloodlines she hoped to establish. They discussed books they'd read, experiences that had shaped them, beliefs they held dear. The more time they spent together, the more Xander felt himself changing, softening, opening, becoming someone he barely recognized but didn't entirely dislike. The nightmares that had plagued him since the war came less frequently. The tension he carried in his shoulders began to ease. He even caught himself whistling one morning as he mucked out stalls, something he couldn't remember doing since before Gettysburg. It was on a clear April morning, with the scent of new growth heavy in the air, that everything shifted between them. Xander had ridden to Hope's ranch at first light, bringing a calf that had been orphaned when its mother died of milk fever. Hope had mentioned having a mare that had lost her foal. Perhaps the mare would accept the calf as a surrogate, giving it a chance at survival. He found Hope in the stable, speaking softly to the grieving mare. The animal's eyes were dull with loss, her head hanging low as Hope stroked her neck. "I brought the calf," Xander said quietly, not wanting to startle either horse or handler. "Not sure this will work, but worth trying." Hope nodded, her expression serious. "Let's bring him in slowly. I've been rubbing her down with a blanket. Use it to wipe the calf before introducing them. Might help if he carries her scent." They worked together methodically, first rubbing the blanket over the mare, then transferring her scent to the confused but hungry calf. When they finally brought the animals together, they held their breath, watching for signs of rejection or acceptance. The mare sniffed the calf warily, her ears flicking back and forth. The calf, desperate for milk, butted hopefully at her flank. For a long moment the outcome hung in the balance. Then, slowly, the mare lowered her head and nuzzled the calf, a soft nickering sound emerging from her throat. It wasn't immediate adoption, but it was a start, a willingness to consider this strange, not quite right offspring as potentially her own. "Well, I'll be damned," Xander murmured. "Might actually work." Hope's smile was radiant as she watched the tentative bonding. "Life finds a way," she said softly, "sometimes in the most unexpected forms." They stayed in the stall for over an hour, watching as the mare gradually accepted the calf's attempts to nurse. It was a delicate balance, intervening when necessary to guide the calf to the teats, stepping back to allow the animals to form their own connection. When the calf finally latched successfully and began to suckle in earnest, Hope let out a small sound of triumph, instinctively reaching for Xander's hand. He took it without thinking, their fingers intertwining as they watched the unlikely pair before them. The simple contact, hand in hand, shoulders touching as they stood side by side, affected Xander more profoundly than he could have anticipated. It wasn't just the physical warmth of her skin against his. It was the shared joy, the wordless communication, the sense of accomplishment in what they'd achieved together. When Hope turned to look up at him, her eyes bright with emotion, something inside Xander broke open. Later, he wouldn't be able to say who moved first, only that one moment they were standing apart, and the next his arms were around her, her face tilted up to his, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like coming home after a very long journey. It wasn't a perfect kiss. Too many years had passed since either had practiced such intimacy. But what it lacked in technique it made up for in genuine feeling, in the release of emotions too long contained. When they finally broke apart, Xander kept his arms around her, afraid that if he let go, the moment would shatter like ice in spring. "I didn't plan that," he said roughly. Hope pressed her fingers gently to his lips, stopping his words. "I know," she said simply. "Neither did I. But I'm not sorry it happened." Relief flooded through him at her words. "Neither am I," he admitted. "Though I probably should be. I've got nothing to offer a woman like you, Hope. My place is run down, my prospects limited." "I'm not even sure I remember how to stop," she interrupted, her voice firm but kind. "I'm not asking for promises or proposals, Xander. I'm not even asking for anything beyond this moment." She smiled slightly, her eyes holding his. "Though I wouldn't object if you wanted to kiss me again sometime." The simple honesty of her statement, free from expectation or demand, eased the panic that had begun to rise in Xander's chest. This wasn't a trap or a trick. It was just Hope, being as straightforward as she'd always been. "I think that could be arranged," he replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. They might have stayed there longer, exploring this new territory opening between them, if not for Jackson's voice calling from outside the stable, asking for Hope's help with another foaling mare. Reality intruded, reminding them of responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. With reluctance, they separated, though Xander kept hold of Hope's hand for a moment longer. "We should talk," he said. "Later, about this." Hope nodded, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we should. Come for supper tonight." As he rode home later that morning, Xander found himself in a state of bewildered euphoria. The kiss replayed in his mind the softness of Hope's lips, the way she'd fitted perfectly against him, the small sound she'd made when they'd finally broken apart. He hadn't kissed a woman since, before the war, had convinced himself. He no longer needed or wanted such connections. But the feelings awakened by that single moment of intimacy were undeniable. Desire, certainly, but more than that, a hunger for closeness, for the particular comfort that came from being truly known by another person. It terrified him almost as much as it exhilarated him. By the time he returned to Hope's cabin that evening, Xander had worked himself into a state of nervous anticipation that made him feel like a green boy rather than a man of 38. He'd bathed and shaved with unusual care, put on his cleanest shirt, and even attempted to tame his unruly hair. Hope greeted him at the door with a smile that eased some of his anxiety. She, too, had made an effort. Her hair was down from its usual practical braid, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a dress rather than her usual work clothes. "You look nice," Xander said, the compliment awkward but sincere. Hope's smile widened. "So do you. Come in. I've sent Jackson and Lewis into town for supplies. They won't be back until tomorrow." The implication of their privacy hung in the air between them as Xander followed her inside. The table was set for two, candles casting a warm glow over the simple but appetizing meal she'd prepared. "I'm not much of a cook," Hope admitted as they sat down, "but I managed not to burn the roast, at least." The meal passed in conversation that was surprisingly easy despite the undercurrent of tension between them. They discussed the day's work, the progress of the calves and foals, The plans for moving Xander's cattle back to his land now that spring grazing was available. It wasn't until they had finished eating and moved to sit before the fire, coffee cups in hand, that Hope broached the subject they'd been circling all evening. "About this morning," she began, her eyes on the flames. "I meant what I said. I'm not sorry it happened. But I understand if you regret it, or if you'd rather we pretend it didn't." "I don't," Xander interrupted, his voice more forceful than he'd intended. "Regret it, I mean." He set his cup aside, leaning forward in his chair. "Hope, I've been alone a long time, by choice mostly. After the war, after everything I'd seen and done, I didn't think I deserved anything good, didn't think I was capable of it anymore." Hope's eyes met his, steady and compassionate. "And now," Xander ran a hand through his hair, struggling to articulate the tumult of emotions within him. "Now I'm not so sure. Being around you, seeing how you've rebuilt your life after what you endured, it makes me wonder if maybe I've been wrong all these years, if maybe there's still a chance for something more than just surviving." The admission cost him, exposing vulnerabilities he'd protected for so long. But Hope's response, reaching across to take his hand, her fingers warm and reassuring against his, made the risk worthwhile. "I think there is," she said softly, "for both of us." Her touch anchored him, gave him the courage to continue. "I don't know how to do this, Hope. It's been so long since I let anyone close. I'll make mistakes. I'll probably hurt you without meaning to." Hope's smile was gentle but knowing. "Of course you will. And I'll hurt you too, because that's what happens when people care about each other. We're human, Xander, flawed and fumbling and scared, but I think—" She paused, her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand. "I think maybe we could fumble through it together if you're willing to try." The simplicity of her offer, not a demand for certainty or perfection, but an invitation to attempt something neither of them fully remembered how to do, touched Xander deeply. "I am," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Willing to try, I mean." Hope rose from her chair then, still holding his hand, and drew him to his feet. Standing before him, her face tilted up to his, she embodied both strength and vulnerability in a way that humbled him. "Then kiss me again," she whispered, "and we'll see where it leads." This time, there was no hesitation. Xander gathered her into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other at the small of her back, drawing her close. Their lips met with greater confidence than before, the initial tentativeness giving way to a deeper exploration of sensation and desire. Hope responded with an enthusiasm that surprised and delighted him, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his with unmistakable intent. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "Hope," he murmured, her name a question and a plea all at once. She understood, as she seemed to understand so many things about him without words. "Yes," she said simply. "If you want to." "I do," he admitted. "But I don't want to rush you or assume." Hope silenced him with another kiss, brief but decisive. "Xander," she said when they parted, "I'm 34 years old, a widow, not a maiden in need of protection from her own desires." Her eyes held his, clear and direct. "I want this. I want you. The only question is whether you feel the same." The frankness of her declaration, so at odds with the coyness or shame he might have expected from a woman discussing such matters, only increased his admiration for her. Hope Zimmerman was unlike anyone he'd ever known, strong, honest, unafraid to claim what she wanted. "I do," he said, his voice low and certain. "I want you more than I've wanted anything in a very long time." What followed was a rediscovery for both of them of pleasure long denied, of the particular joy that comes from intimate connection freely given and received. They moved to Hope's bedroom, where lamplight cast golden shadows across the simple space. There, they undressed each other slowly, with reverent hands and murmured encouragements. Each revelation of skin met with appreciation rather than judgment. Xander's body bore the marks of his past, a bullet scar on his shoulder from Antietam, the evidence of a Comanche arrow on his thigh, the accumulated wear of hard years on the frontier. Hope's carried its own history, the faint lines across her back that could only have come from a belt or whip, the slight crookedness of a once broken finger that hadn't healed properly. Neither commented on these signs of past pain. Instead, they honored them with gentle touches, acknowledging without words the paths that had brought them to this shared moment. Their lovemaking was not the frenzied coupling of youth, but something more measured, more profound, the coming together of two people who had known enough of life's harshness to truly value its sweetness. They took their time, learning each other's bodies, discovering what brought pleasure, building slowly toward a shared release that left them trembling and breathless in each other's arms. Afterward, lying together in the quiet darkness, Xander held Hope close against his chest, her head tucked beneath his chin, their heartbeats gradually slowing to a shared rhythm. It struck him that he couldn't remember the last time he had held someone like this, not for pleasure or necessity, but simply for the comfort of connection. "What are you thinking?" Hope asked softly, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his skin. Xander considered the question, wanting to be as honest with her as she had been with him. "That I don't deserve this," he finally said. "That I don't deserve you, but I'm grateful anyway." Hope pushed herself up on one elbow, looking down at him with a mixture of tenderness and exasperation. "Deserve has nothing to do with it," she said firmly. "We've both survived things that should have broken us. We've both built lives from the rubble. If anyone deserves a chance at happiness, it's us." Her certainty was like a balm to the doubts that still plagued him. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not wisdom," she replied with a slight smile. "Just hard-won perspective." She settled back against him, her body warm and trusting against his. "Besides, I'm not offering you perfection, Xander, just possibility, possibility." The word echoed in his mind as they drifted toward sleep, Hope's breathing deep and even against him. For so long, he had lived with only the certainty of his solitude, the predictable rhythm of days that followed one after another without expectation of change. Now, in this woman's arms, he found himself contemplating a future unfolding in ways he couldn't predict, or control, a life not just endured but embraced, with all its potential for both pain and joy. It terrified him. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, it also filled him with something that felt remarkably like hope. As spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, transforming the dormant earth into a canvas of green and wildflowers, a similar transformation took place in Xander Colt. The man who had once been known only for his forbidding demeanor and solitary ways became something of a marvel to the residents of Independence. The first whispers started when he was seen accompanying Hope Zimmerman to church one Sunday in late April, not sitting apart as was his custom on his rare appearances, but beside her in the pew, clean-shaven and wearing his good suit. Then came his appearance at the general store, where he actually engaged Mrs. Peterson in conversation about her new grandchild, instead of conducting his business in terse monosyllables. But the true shock came at the Independence Founders' Day celebration in May, when Xander not only attended the community gathering but was observed dancing with Hope in the town square, his usual scowl replaced by something that, if not quite a smile, was at least a reasonable approximation of contentment. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jackson remarked to Lewis as they watched the couple from the sidelines. "Man was hard as granite when we first came to work for Miss Hope." "She's got a way about her," Lewis agreed, taking a swig from his cup of punch. Reminds me of my ma, gentle but strong. Kind of person that makes you want to be better than you are. The changes weren't just in public appearances. Back at the Broken Arrow, Xander found himself making improvements he'd long neglected, repainting the cabin, planting a small garden, adding a porch where he and Hope could sit in the evenings watching the sun set over the mountains. But the most significant changes were the ones only he and Hope could see: the way he'd begun to speak more freely of his thoughts and feelings, the decrease in nightmares that left him gasping for breath in the dark hours, the gradual lowering of the defenses he'd maintained for so long. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the darkness returned, when memories of the war or simply the habits of a lifetime of solitude made him withdraw, made him doubt the wisdom of opening himself to potential loss. On those days, Hope gave him space but never abandoned him to his isolation. She would simply be there, working alongside him in comfortable silence, offering quiet support without demand. And there were times when Hope's own past haunted her, moments when a sudden movement would make her flinch, or when a particular tone of voice would cause her to go still and watchful. Xander learned to recognize these moments, to be gentle and patient as she had been with him. They were healing each other, slowly but surely, through the simple act of caring enough to try. June brought the annual cattle drive to the railhead at Helena, a journey of several days that would take Xander away from Hope for the first time since they had become intimate. The night before his departure, they sat on the porch of the Broken Arrow, watching the fireflies rise from the grass as dusk settled over the land. "I'll miss you," Hope said simply, her head resting against his shoulder. Xander's arm tightened around her. "It's only for a week, 10 days at most." "I know. Still." She looked up at him, her expression serious in the fading light. "Be careful. Come back to me." The naked vulnerability in her voice touched something deep within him. For so long there had been no one who would have noticed or cared if he never returned from a journey. Now there was Hope, whose life had become so intertwined with his own that separation, even temporary, felt like losing a limb. "I will," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always." The cattle drive went smoothly, better than expected, with good weather and no significant problems along the trail. The price Xander got for his herd in Helena was higher than he'd hoped, putting him in an unusually good mood as he began the journey home. He found himself pushing the pace, eager to return to Hope. She had changed him, he realized as he rode, had softened the hard edges of his character without weakening what lay beneath. With her, he was becoming the man he might have been if the war hadn't intervened, if life hadn't taught him to expect the worst at every turn. It was a strange feeling, this mixture of vulnerability and strength. Strange, but not unwelcome. He was a day's ride from Independence when he encountered a group of men making camp by the trail, 4 rough-looking characters whose horses bore the signs of hard travel. Normally, Xander would have ridden past with no more than a nod of acknowledgement. But something about the men, their watchful eyes, the way they fell silent as he approached, raised his instincts for trouble. "Evening," one of the men called as Xander slowed his horse. "Fine day for traveling." "It is," Xander agreed, keeping his tone neutral. "You fellows heading to Independence?" The man glanced at his companions before answering. "Might be. Heard there's opportunity in these parts. Mining, maybe, or ranch work." "Not much mining around Independence," Xander replied. "Some ranches might need hands depending on the season." "That's so." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Any particular ranches you'd recommend?" Xander's unease grew. There was something predatory in the question, a hidden intent he couldn't quite discern. "Can't say. Don't know what skills you bring to the table." "Oh, we've got skills," another of the men interjected, his hand resting too casually near his holstered pistol. "All sorts of useful skills." "Well, good luck to you then," Xander said, preparing to ride on. "Independence is a day's ride south, just follow the trail." As he urged his horse forward, the first man called after him. "Say, you wouldn't happen to know a woman named Hope Zimmerman, would you? Runs a horse breeding operation, from what we hear." Xander froze, ice forming in his veins at the mention of Hope's name. Slowly, he turned his horse back toward the men. "Who's asking?" he demanded, all pretense of casual conversation gone from his voice. The man's smile widened, turning ugly. "Just an old friend of the family, you might say. Frederick Zimmerman was my cousin. Been looking for his widow for quite some time now." Understanding dawned, cold and clear. These men weren't seeking work, they were hunting Hope. Whether for revenge or for something she'd taken when she fled St. Louis, Xander couldn't be sure, but their intentions were clearly malevolent. "Never heard of her," he lied smoothly, his hand drifting toward his own weapon. "Must be thinking of some other town." "Now that's strange," the man replied, his tone conversational but his eyes hard. "Because we have it on good authority that she purchased property near Independence about a year ago. Paid cash, from what I understand, cash that rightly belongs to Frederick's family." "Like I said," Xander repeated, "never heard of her. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a long ride ahead." He could feel their eyes on his back as he rode away, could almost taste the threat in the air. They didn't believe him, why would they? But he'd bought some time at least. Time to warn Hope, to prepare for whatever these men might be planning. Xander rode through the night, pushing his horse to its limits, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the animal. By dawn, he was within sight of Independence, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. Hope's ranch was his first stop, but as he approached, he could see that something was wrong. The front door of the cabin stood open, and Hope's prized riding mare was not in the corral where she should have been. His heart pounding, Xander dismounted and approached cautiously, his gun drawn. "Hope," he called, scanning the area for signs of trouble. "Jackson, Lewis," a groan from inside the stable drew his attention. He found Lewis there, slumped against a stall door, blood matting his hair where he'd been struck. "Lewis, what happened? Where's Hope?" Xander demanded, kneeling beside the injured man. "Riders," Lewis gasped, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. "4 of them came before dawn, said they were friends of Hope's late husband." He coughed, pain evident in his features. "They were lying." Jackson knew it right away, tried to stop them. They shot him. Xander's blood ran cold. "Jackson's dead," Lewis nodded grimly. "Hope heard the shot, came running. They grabbed her, said something about taking back what was theirs. She fought like a wildcat, but—" He shook his head. "They took her. Headed east, toward the high country." "How long ago?" Xander asked, already calculating distances, possibilities. 2 hours, maybe a bit more. Xander helped Lewis to his feet and into the cabin, where he quickly bandaged the man's head wound. "I'm going after them," he said, gathering ammunition from Hope's stores. "Can you ride?" Lewis nodded, though his face was pale with pain. "Enough to get to town, get the sheriff." "Do that. Tell him to follow our trail, but don't wait for him. I'm leaving now." As Lewis shakily mounted a horse, Xander prepared for pursuit. He selected the fastest horse from Hope's corral, a black gelding he knew had both speed and endurance. He packed light: ammunition, water, jerky, a blanket, nothing that would slow him down. "Be careful," Lewis called as Xander swung into the saddle. "These men, they're not just thieves. The way they talked about Hope like she was property that had been stolen from them." "I understand," Xander replied grimly. He understood all too well what kind of men would hunt down a woman who had fled an abusive marriage, men who saw women as possessions, who couldn't tolerate the shame of being left. men who would kill without hesitation to restore what they saw as their family's honor. The thought of Hope in their hands, afraid and alone, filled Xander with a cold rage unlike anything he'd felt since the war. But beneath the anger was something else, fear, raw and primal, that he might lose her before he'd had the chance to tell her what she meant to him. With that fear driving him, Xander set off on the trail of the men who had taken the woman he loved. The trail wasn't difficult to follow. 4 riders with a struggling captive didn't prioritize stealth, and the men seemed confident that no one would pursue them immediately. They headed east into the mountains, using game trails that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Xander pushed hard, closing the gap hour by hour. His experience as a Union scout during the war served him well now, reading sign, anticipating the route his quarry would take, conserving his horse's strength for the moments when speed mattered most. By mid-afternoon, he knew he was close. Fresh droppings from their horses, still warm to the touch. An empty whiskey bottle discarded by the trail. A scrap of fabric caught on a thorn bush that he recognized as being from Hope's shirt. He slowed his pace, approaching more cautiously. The terrain had opened into a small meadow bordered by dense pine forest on 3 sides, and a steep rocky slope on the 4th. Smoke from a campfire rose in a thin column against the blue sky. Xander dismounted, secured his horse, and approached on foot, moving silently through the trees until he had a clear view of the camp. What he saw made his blood boil. Hope sat with her back against a large boulder, her hands bound before her. A dark bruise marked her cheekbone, and her lip was split and swollen. But her eyes were clear and defiant as she watched her captors, who were gathered around the fire arguing amongst themselves. "I say we head for Wyoming territory," one was saying. "Cross into Colorado from there. Throw off any pursuit." "And I say that's a waste of time," another countered, the man who had claimed to be Frederick Zimmerman's cousin. "No one's coming for her. That rancher we met on the trail didn't even recognize her name." "He was lying," a third man interjected. "Could see it in his eyes." "He knows her. Even if he does, what's one man going to do against the 4 of us?" The cousin laughed, an ugly sound. "Besides, once we get what we came for, it won't matter who follows. We'll be long gone and she'll be dead." The casual mention of killing Hope sent a surge of rage through Xander that he had to forcibly control. Rushing in would only get them both killed. He needed a plan. Studying the camp, he noted the positions of all 4 men. 2 by the fire, including the cousin. 1 standing guard near Hope. The 4th at the edge of the clearing, tending to the horses. If he could take out the guard and the man with the horses quietly, he'd have a better chance against the remaining 2. Circling through the trees, Xander positioned himself behind the man watching the horses. The abductor was bent over, checking a shoe on one of the mounts, his back to the forest. Xander moved swiftly, clamping one hand over the man's mouth while the other drove his hunting knife into the kidney. It was a brutal but silent kill, and the man went limp with barely a sound. 1 down. The guard near Hope was trickier. He was alert, his rifle ready, his gaze constantly scanning the surrounding trees. Xander would need a distraction. Picking up a stone, he threw it into the underbrush on the far side of the clearing. The guard turned toward the sound, rifle raised. "What is it?" One of the men at the fire called. "Thought I heard something," the guard replied, taking a step away from Hope. "Probably just a deer." That moment of distraction was all Xander needed. He emerged from the trees behind the guard, his knife finding the man's throat before he could cry out. The guard's rifle clattered to the ground as he fell. The noise alerted the 2 men at the fire. They leapt to their feet, drawing their weapons as they scanned the clearing. "Hank, what was that?" the cousin called. "Hank." Xander stepped out from behind the boulder where Hope sat bound, his revolver leveled at the men. "Drop your guns," he commanded, his voice cold as winter, "or die where you stand." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the cousin's face twisted in recognition and rage. "You," he spat. "The rancher from the trail." "That's right," Xander confirmed. "Now drop your weapons, I won't ask again." The second man began to lower his pistol, but the cousin's face hardened with determination. "You think I'm afraid to die?" he sneered. "I came here for justice, and I'll have it." He swung his gun toward Hope, intent on at least completing that part of his mission if he couldn't escape. But Xander was faster. His first shot took the cousin through the heart, dropping him instantly. His second caught the other man in the shoulder as he tried to bring his weapon to bear. The wounded man staggered, his pistol falling from nerveless fingers as he clutched at his bleeding shoulder. "Don't kill me," he begged, falling to his knees. "I only came for the money, I swear. I don't care about the woman." "What money?" Xander demanded, keeping his gun trained on the man as he moved to cut Hope's bonds. "The inheritance," the man gasped. "Frederick's inheritance that she stole when she ran. Thousands in gold and bonds. Harrison," he nodded toward the dead cousin, "said it was rightfully his as next of kin." "There was no theft," Hope said, rubbing her wrists as Xander freed her. "Frederick left everything to me in his will. His family contested it but lost in court." Her voice was steady despite the bruises on her face. "They couldn't accept that he chose me over them, even after death." The wounded man looked between them, his face pale with blood loss and fear. "I didn't know," he pleaded. "Harrison just said she stole what was his, paid us to help get it back. And you didn't question why getting it back involved kidnapping and murder?" Xander asked coldly. Before the man could answer, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. Xander tensed, ready for more trouble but relaxed when he saw Sheriff Miller leading a posse that included Lewis and several men from town. "Looks like we're late to the party," the sheriff observed as he surveyed the scene. "You all right, Miss Zimmerman?" Hope nodded, moving to stand beside Xander. "Thanks to Xander, yes." As the sheriff and his men secured the surviving kidnapper and collected the bodies of the others, Xander pulled Hope aside, his eyes searching her face with concern. "Are you really all right?" he asked quietly. "They hurt you?" Hope touched her bruised cheek with a wry smile. "Nothing that won't heal. I've had worse." The simple statement, with all it implied about her former life, filled Xander with a complex mixture of rage at what she had endured and profound gratitude that she had survived to find her way to independence and to him. "When Lewis told me they'd taken you," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought I might lose you before I ever told you." Hope's eyes softened as she looked up at him. "Told me what?" Xander took her hands in his, aware of the dirt and blood that stained them both but beyond caring about appearances. "That I love you," he said simply. "That you've changed everything for me. That the walls I built to keep the world out were also keeping me from really living, not just existing." Tears filled Hope's eyes, but her smile was radiant despite her injuries. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since that first day in the general store, when you looked at me like I was the most puzzling creature you'd ever encountered." Xander laughed softly, drawing her gently into his arms. "You were. Still are, sometimes." "Good," Hope replied, settling against his chest with a contented sigh. "Keeps things interesting." As they rode home together, side by side under the vast Montana sky, Xander found himself contemplating a future he had never dared to imagine. Not just survival, not just endurance, but a life filled with purpose and joy, with challenges met together rather than alone. "Move in with me," he said suddenly as they crested the rise that overlooked both their properties. "To the Broken Arrow, Or I'll move to your place. Or we could build something new. I don't care where, as long as we're together." Hope's surprise gave way to consideration as she studied him. "Are you asking me to marry you, Xander Colt?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "I am, if you'll have me." Her smile was answer enough, but she gave him the words anyway. "Yes, I will." 2 weeks later, on a perfect June morning with the mountains standing sentinel in the distance, Hope Zimmerman became Hope Colt in a simple ceremony in Independence's small church. The entire town turned out for the occasion, drawn as much by curiosity about the transformation of their most notorious recluse as by genuine goodwill toward the couple. "Never seen Colt smile so much," one old-timer remarked to another as they watched the newlyweds emerge from the church. "Didn't think his face could manage it, to be honest." "Love changes a person," his companion replied sagely, "even the ones who seem beyond reaching." Indeed, few who had known Xander before Hope's arrival would have recognized the man who stood on the church steps, his face alight with joy as he looked at his bride. The harsh lines that had marked his features had softened, the perpetual wariness in his eyes replaced by contentment. After a modest reception at the town hall, the couple returned to what had been the Broken Arrow Ranch, but was now to be known as the New Dawn, a name that signified the fresh beginning they had found in each other. "What do you think?" Hope asked as they stood on the porch of the cabin that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Is it too sentimental a name?" Xander's arm tightened around her waist as he considered the question. "No," he decided. "It fits. This is a new dawn for both of us." Hope leaned into his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't bought the Jenkins place? If we hadn't become neighbors?" "Sometimes," Xander admitted. "But then I remember something my mother used to say, 'What's meant to be will find a way.'" He turned to face her, his hands framing her face gently. "I think we were meant to find each other, Hope, to heal each other. No matter where or when, we would have found our way to this." Hope's eyes shimmered with emotion as she reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that years of solitude had etched there. "For a man who claimed not to know how to love anymore, you have quite a way with words, husband." Xander smiled, the expression now coming more naturally to him than the scowl that had once been his habitual mask. "I had a good teacher," he replied softly, lowering his lips to hers. "Someone who showed me that it's never too late to learn how to love again." As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above them, Xander reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. From the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg to the peaceful Montana ranch where he had finally found home. From the broken, bitter man who had arrived in Independence, determined to keep the world at bay, to the husband who now held his heart's desire in his arms. The walls he had built so carefully had indeed crumbled, not in catastrophic collapse as he had feared, but stone by stone, with each act of courage that had allowed Hope closer. And in their place had grown something far stronger. A love built on mutual respect and understanding, on shared pain and healing, on the recognition of two kindred spirits who had found in each other not just solace but redemption. "Teach me how to love," he had asked her once, in a rare moment of vulnerability during their courtship. And she had answered not with words but with patience, with unwavering presence, with a belief in his capacity for tenderness that had ultimately proved self-fulfilling. Now, as the last light faded from the sky and they turned to enter their home, truly a home now, not merely shelter, Xander knew that the lesson would continue for the rest of their lives together. There would be challenges ahead, setbacks and sorrows as well as joys. But they would face them together, drawing strength from the bond they had forged against all odds. And that, he realized as Hope's hand found his in the gathering darkness, was the greatest gift of all, not the absence of struggle, but the certainty that whatever came, they would no longer face it alone. Epilogue. 10 years later, the New Dawn Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the territory. Hope's horse breeding program had developed a reputation that drew buyers from as far away as California and Texas, while Xander's cattle business had expanded to include a successful partnership with neighboring ranchers for driving herds to market. But their greatest pride was not in their material success, but in the family they had created. Two sons, William, age 8, and Thomas, age 6, brought laughter and energy to a home that had once known only silence. And 4-year-old Elizabeth, with her mother's honey-colored hair and her father's determined chin, ruled the household with benevolent tyranny that had even the ranch hands wrapped around her tiny finger. On a warm summer evening, as the children played in the yard under the watchful eye of Jackson's widow Martha, who had become the children's beloved nanny, Xander and Hope sat on the expanded porch of their home, watching the sun sink toward the mountains. "Penny for your thoughts," Hope said, observing the contemplative expression on her husband's face. Xander smiled, taking her hand in his. The years had been kind to them both. Hope's beauty had matured, gaining a depth and character that made her more striking at 44 than she had been at 34. Xander's hair had begun to silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke more of laughter now than of pain. "I was thinking about the first time we met," he replied. "In Peterson's store. How I tried to warn you off, told you the Jenkins place wasn't safe for a woman alone." Hope laughed, the sound as warm and welcome to him now as it had been a decade ago. "You were quite intimidating, as I recall. Or at least you thought you were. And you weren't impressed in the slightest," Xander acknowledged with a rueful grin. "Should have known then what I was in for." Hope squeezed his hand, her expression softening. "Would you change any of it if you could go back?" Xander looked out at their children playing in the golden evening light, then back at the woman who had transformed his life with her courage and love. "Not a single moment," he said with absolute conviction. "Every step, every mistake, every triumph, it all led us here. And here is exactly where I want to be." As if to punctuate his words, Elizabeth broke away from her brothers and ran to the porch, her small face alight with excitement. "Papa, Mama, look what I found." In her cupped hands was a tiny nest that had fallen from a tree, perfect and empty, a small miracle of natural architecture. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Hope said, bending to examine the treasure. "But we should put it back near the tree in case the mother bird is looking for it." Elizabeth considered this seriously, then nodded. "Will you help me, Papa? I can't reach the branches." "Of course," Xander replied, rising and swinging his daughter onto his shoulders with practiced ease. "Let's go see if we can find the right spot." As they walked away, Elizabeth chattering happily from her perch, Hope watched them with a heart full of gratitude. The harsh, solitary man she had met that day in the general store had become a devoted husband and a tender, patient father who could spend hours teaching his sons to ride or listening to his daughter's elaborate stories. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. There had been difficult moments, nightmares that still occasionally plagued them both, times when old wounds reopened and needed gentle tending. But through it all, they had kept their promise to each other to face life's challenges together, to choose connection over isolation, hope over despair. When Xander returned to the porch, having settled the nest in a safe spot under Elizabeth's direction, he found Hope waiting with 2 glasses of lemonade and a smile that still had the power to quicken his heart. "The children want a story before bed," she told him as he settled beside her again. I told them you would tell the one about how we met. Xander raised an eyebrow. The real story or the suitable for children version? The real one, Hope decided. Or at least most of it. They're old enough to understand that love sometimes requires courage, and that the best things in life often come to us when we least expect them. Later, as the children gathered around in their nightclothes, eyes wide with anticipation, Xander began the tale they'd heard many times but never tired of. Once, not so very long ago, there was a man who thought he knew everything about life, he said, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. He believed that the safest way to live was behind walls so high and thick that nothing and no one could reach him. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't unhappy either. He simply existed day after day, convinced that was all life had to offer him. And then he met Mama, William interjected eagerly. Xander smiled, ruffling his eldest son's hair. That's right. He met a woman who wasn't afraid of his walls, who saw through them to the man hiding inside. A woman who had built her own walls but had learned how to open gates in them instead of living in isolation. Was the man scared? Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. Terrified, Xander confirmed. Because letting someone past your defenses means risking pain. But it also means experiencing joy and love and all the things that make life worth living. And they lived happily ever after, Elizabeth concluded with satisfaction, snuggling deeper under her covers. They did, Hope agreed, bending to kiss each child goodnight. But not because life was perfect or easy. They lived happily because they chose to face whatever came together, and because they never forgot how precious their love was. As they left the children's room, closing the door softly behind them, Xander pulled Hope into his arms, overcome by a sudden wave of emotion. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair. "For what?" she asked, looking up at him with love shining in her eyes. "For staying," he said simply. "For teaching me how to live again. For giving me more happiness than I ever believed possible." Hope reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the familiar contours with infinite tenderness. "Thank you for being willing to learn," she replied. "For having the courage to tear down those walls brick by brick. For building this life with me." Outside their window, the vast Montana sky blazed with stars, witnesses to the remarkable journey of two wounded souls who had found in each other not just healing but transformation. From harsh solitude to tender companionship, from guarded survival to open-hearted living, they had traveled a path neither could have walked alone. And as they stood together in the quiet darkness of their home, surrounded by the family they had created and the love they had nurtured, Xander and Hope knew with absolute certainty that this moment, this life, this love was what they had been seeking all along, without even knowing what they searched for. It was, in every sense, their new dawn,